Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are doing the first half of Act 4, Scene 4 today, and we are stopping after Eteocleus leaves with the clown and shepherdesses, which would make a lot more sense if you were reading along with me than it does just out in the middle of nowhere. So, to try and make a little more sense for everybody, I will summarize what happens in the first part of the scene, and then we'll talk about things in a little more depth. So we finally get to meet Florenzel and Perdita. It turns out it's time for the sheep shearing festival, and the two of them have got some real flirt on, if you know what I mean. We meet them at the start of the scene where we discover that Florenzel has encouraged Perdita to dress up as the goddess Flora, who's a goddess of flowers, as the hostess for this feast. Now she feels a little silly because she thinks maybe she's putting on too much of a show, and ultimately she sort of jokes about the fact that Florenzel's father probably wouldn't be happy to see him dressed up as a commoner. So they're both playing out roles today. This tells us that Perdita is in fact aware of who Florenzel is, though she and he have a name for him that he's going under as a commoner, and that is Dorcles. I'm not going to use that because it sounds like you're trying to be Heracles or Pericles, and you got Dork instead. Again, most of these names are in reference to other things, so jokes. I will be using Florenzel because that's what the script uses, and Dorcles unfortunately also gets mixed up a little bit with Dorcas, which is one of the names of one of the shepherdesses in this scene. So, we will going by Florenzel. Florenzel reminds her that even the gods disguise themselves for those that they loved, and everything's fine. It's fine. My father's not gonna come out here. Except for the fact that they're then joined by the old shepherd, who is Perdita's supposed father, the clown, Perdita's supposed brother, some shepherdesses, the previous Dorcas and Mopsa, and two strangers to this party who we ourselves know to be Polonius and Carmillo. Shenanigans time. So, Perdita's like, oh great, party's starting, time to actually play this role, and she goes around the group and hands out flowers to everybody that are meant to be appropriate flowers, and it seems to be based a lot on age. The older gentleman, Paulinus, gets winter flowers, which he says are appropriate. She gives midsummer flowers to Carmillo, who's middle-aged, and then to all the young folks, including her dear Florenzel, she gives spring flowers. But as she's doing this, sort of in the middle, she has a conversation with the King of Bohemia that she's not aware of about nature and art and the breeding of artificial flowers. That is, you know, breeding two types of flowers together to get a hybrid flower. Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. Okay. So after this, and it goes on for quite a bit, I'm not gonna get into the flower language. The footnotes do plenty of that. And, of course, you can always just go nuts with the flower language. Figure out what he's saying. I deeply regret the death of Lily. I'm going to set all that aside. It goes on for a while, and then Florenzel and Perdita, never minding everybody there, get some real flirt on. Especially when Perdita, being maybe a little more forward than you think, states that she would love to just shower Florenzel in flowers. He asks if she means like a corpse, and she goes, no, like a love den, you stupid man. Like, I want to shower the ground with flowers so that we can have sex on it. And he's like, oh, oh, oh. And then they go off and start the dance. Yep. Yep, that happened. That happened a whole lot. So as they go off to start the dance and other shepherds and shepherdesses end up joining in, Polynice can't help but wonder who Perdita actually is, because she seems to be, you know, far and above the commoners around her. This conversation, though, is interrupted when a servant enters to tell them that a traveling salesman who can sing with the voice of the gods is here, and shall we invite him in? And of course, it's Autocleus, who's already robbed the clown once, who's showing up with a bunch of songs to sell, ribbons to sell, gloves to sell, and it turns out the clown seems to have a relationship with both Dorcas and Mopsa, and is interested in some of the gentleman's wares, but also may be interested in something a little more a wink wink, a nudge nudge. And so we finish with the clown and shepherdesses heading out, having told Autocleus to come along. We're going to do this in private over there, because the older folks seem to have fallen into a melancholy conversation. Shenanigans. Yeah, no, it's a lot of things happening, which is meant to give you the sense again of a party. But sometimes, we somehow have a bunch of, like, deep conversations mixed in with sexual innuendo. I have never seen this more clearly than the servant coming in and mentioning that this traveling salesman is outside with songs that are full of... I'm gonna have to read the line just because it's one of those super awkward ones. Okay. He has songs for men and women of all sizes. No milliner can so fit his customers with gloves. He has the prettiest songs for maids, so without baldry, which is strange, with such delicate burdens of dildos and fadings. Jump her and thump her. Yep. Song just filled with dildos. Now, and again, the footnotes here are very useful in telling you that this is probably like a double entendre, because dildo used to be used as sort of a nonsense word, and they give an example with the high dildo dill, high do dill dird lie, like just nonsense do type things, except one that can show up in innocent songs, and the more obscene songs aren't likely to survive as long. They're not likely to have been kept. But we know for sure that a dildo was in fact what we imagine when we say dildo, as an artificial penis, was a thing in Shakespeare's time. So we suddenly have this servant who's saying, oh, he has some completely innocent songs for maids full of dildos, and you're just like, did you mean to do that? You made it dirty. You made it dirty. And that's sort of happening throughout this entire scene. Like I said, she says, I wanna cover my boy in flowers, and he's like a corpse, and she's like a nice place where we can lie down with each other, dude. Kiss more. Like, it is sort of that thing of this completely innocent place where we're talking about flowers and springtime, and underneath it all is just what happens in springtime. How do the animals get busy? Like, it is sheep shearing time, but soon those sheep are going to be off and creating lambs, right? And so as we go through, we're partially supposed to look at this couple that we know are both, in fact, highborn, and see them as this idyllic pair, especially then paired with something like a clown and his two shepherdesses, because he claims at the moment he's with Mopsa, and then Dorcas says something, and Mopsa's just like, yeah, well, he probably made you pregnant, so, like, get out. And you're just kind of like, oh. And by the time they leave, it seems to be, in fact, as a group, as a threesome here, where the clown even says that he'll be buying gifts for both girls. So we're supposed to be seeing a difference here in acts. Like, Perdita and Florenzel go to dance, and they're in the limelight, everybody's watching them, while the clown and the shepherdesses leave the area, leave the stage, right? So we are supposed to be seeing that difference. But again, if you look at how Florenzel and Perdita talk to each other and talk to other people, you know that they're not so innocent in all of this. Like, they're worldly enough that they know what men and women do when they like each other. It's not, oh, he wanted to hold my hand, we're so serious. It's, I want to have a pretty place among the trees that we bonk. Like, it is that type of thing. And it's sort of strange because the conversation about hybrid flowers is also dual-natured in that way. Because it is speaking to a very strong debate, even today, though most people aren't necessarily aware that they have an opinion on this, which is the difference between nature and art. Nature being naturally made, or made by the gods, or God, and art being man-made. And how do they compare to each other? Is art always an imperfect reflection of nature? Can art improve upon nature? Things like that. And that is sort of the direct conversation that they're having about these flowers. Because Perdita, again, speaking to the fact that she knows things about the world, calls a certain type of flower nature's bastard. Which, again, is a child born out of wedlock, or born to somebody out of wedlock, even though you're in wedlock with somebody else. So nature's bastard is then formed by mankind interfering and breeding two unlike flowers together to make a third hybrid, right? And so the conversation is about this flower. Is this flower part of nature? Is it mimicking nature? Is that mimicry complementary or insulting? But the second conversation that's happening here is the breeding conversation. And again, it is Perdita that calls this out. Because the conversation that Polyenix is having seems to be primarily on that art and nature conversation, where he goes on to say that nature makes the means for art, and thus somehow art is part of nature, which is a fascinating discussion overall. And again, suddenly you're aware of how broad this conversation is. I took an entire class on philosophy and art, and it was precisely this question of art and nature and their relationships to each other, and man's relationship to both of those things as well. And I'm using man here in the general term of humanity, not in the gendered term. So what we end up getting is Polynemics saying that nature makes the means for the creation of these flowers. If these flowers were able to be bred together, even artificially by man, then that flower should be allowed to exist. And he says, so then fill your garden with them. Fill your garden with them. And Perdita then seems to turn this conversation on the head by comparing herself to the flower and making it a question of breeding. And her saying that she wouldn't really want a guy who just saw her all made up and pretty and said, I want to breed with you because of that reason. And you're kind of like, where did this conversation go wrong? Like, we were just talking about a pretty flower, and now we're talking about humans breeding. But it is this sense of that double nature of the conversation, right? Talking about these flowers is also talking about the sexual nature that Perdita finds herself in, the sexual situation Perdita finds herself in, that she's not fully aware of. Because she's seeing maybe herself not as a hybrid flower here, but in fact one of the original flowers that then is bred together with a high-born flower, which would be Florenzel, and what they create, would that be accepted or not? Because we are at a time, of course, where high class and low class aren't meant to come together. Society says no. There are certainly cases where that's not the case, and you do have relationships that even made it work. I'm reading about the War of the Roses and everything leading up to that, and there seems to have been at least one relationship the royal family kept quiet where the Queen Mother had a relationship with a low-born gentleman, and the royal family just took it as shut up and say nothing so that a scandal isn't made out of it, right? If you don't draw attention to it, it's fine. Nobody has to know. And ultimately it was only after the Queen Mother passed away that it became common knowledge. So we seem to have this conversation happening where Perdita is realizing the situation she's in, that, well, it's very complicated, right? Because she says she wouldn't want a gentleman to come after her just because of how she looked. But how she looked is in reference also to the flower, which could mean so much more for her. She wouldn't necessarily want someone to breed with her just because she's highborn or lowborn or a hybrid of any type, right? She wants somebody who will love her fully for herself, not just for how she looks or her status. And she seems to have found that then in Florenzel, right? But she is well aware that the king probably won't approve of any of this. That was stated way back at the beginning of the scene. So you just have this conversation that is full of the language of flowers, that is somehow also a conversation of art and nature, and how the two of them speak together. That's also probably a conversation about sexual maturity within these young folks. And you're just kind of like, well, okay, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Well, Shakespeare then takes a step back, right? So we have this conversation, and then Florenzel and Perdita go to dance together. And we have Polynemics looking at Perdita and saying, like, I don't think she would be a commoner. And again, that's saying there's something physically, mentally, or emotionally different between high-born and low-born characters and people that You can pick somebody out of a crowd. And this then speaks to a different type of nature question, which is the nature versus nurture, which can be considered another question of nature versus art. And the conversation about this one, again, is that nature is the more powerful force at work here. Perdita's nature as a highborn princess shines through the art of being raised as a shepherdess. The nurturing she received doesn't weaken her appearance to be a highborn. And practically everybody's picking her out immediately as somebody important. And somebody higher up than everybody else around here. And Shakespeare then doubles down on this by bringing in Autocleus, and Perdita's the one who's like, nothing dirty. Like, Perdita is the one to make that call. And then, of course, the clowns and the clown and the shepherdesses and Cletus go off and they're singing a song about two women wooing a man, and then the clown's just like, hey, why don't we take this to the other room? Shakespeare is trying to highlight something here. Which is to say, while that sexual conversation might be underneath everything, we are still talking about different levels. And the highborn characters are still going to be on this level up here, while the lowborn characters are going to make more direct sexual innuendos. Again, the one shepherdess accusing the other of getting pregnant via the gentleman that she herself is probably sleeping with. And you're kind of like, Shakespeare, why? Because we discussed prior to this point the shakeup of all these genre conventions and the fact that we are now fully in a comedy. Like, this is a gigantic scene that is here for the shenanigans as we start figuring things out. And we just keep going and going and going until we hit the final act where everything will come together. So we have sort of hit the low-born part of the comedy, but it's done in a really weird way. So we kind of have, to compare to other Shakespearean plays, we have something like Bottom and the Tinkerers making their play performance, right? As the clown, the shepherdess is Cleus over here. But we've also got characters like Romeo and Juliet. That's a possibility over here, right? We have Ophelia and her language of flowers. And the possibility that we can spin this all into madness and a tragedy is still there. Because we know where we started out. We started out with the setup to a tragedy that we've somehow twisted into a comedy, and you're partially wondering if there's going to be a twist back. But Shakespeare, I think, in setting at least the first part of the scene up the way he has, is leaning away from that. He's sort of trying to pull the audience towards the fact that you can have hope. Because we have an interaction between Perdita and Polonius, right? And it's a positive interaction. Where you're just like, ooh, ooh, is this going to turn out well? And then Autocleus comes in, and it's just jokes, jokes and jokes and jokes. And you're kind of like, so maybe it is a comedy from here on out. But it's such a weird one, because it's just interspersed with questions of nature and art. and conversations about gods disguising themselves. Oh, this is a terribly awkward line to read when you know the context of the Greek plays. And it is one that kind of has to get called out right now, as part of that difference between highborn and lowborn, but also the difference between the male gaze and the female object. Because we have Florenzel dressing Perdita up as Flora, and then her commenting that his father probably wouldn't really like him mucking around with all the common folk. And Florenzel then says, well, even the gods transform themselves. Let's again find this. There we go. Okay. Apprehend nothing but jollity. The gods themselves humbled their deities to love, have taken the shapes of beasts upon them. Jupiter became a bull and bellowed, the green Neptune a ram and bleated, the fire-robed god, golden Apollo, a poor humble swan, as I see it now. Yeah, a lot of those were rape scenes. Yeah. In fact, it's interesting that they speak to Apollo becoming a swan, because one of the most well-known relationships was Leda and Zeus as a swan. But, yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the male gods didn't care what the female wanted. And by coming in different forms, well, that adds another layer to it, doesn't it? In fact, we're seeing a very different type of transformation than maybe Florenzel meant to refer to. He's seeing himself as having disguised himself to be with Perdita, but he's not human becoming something other than human. He is a highborn person becoming like a lowborn person. If you look at the scale of things, usually you have gods up here, humans, and then beasts. And the gods feel it necessary to travel down to being a beast to have a relationship with humans. And not consensual ones. Like I said, these are not... The woman has a choice here. This is Zeus showing up as a shower of gold and impregnating woman. This is Zeus showing up as a swan and beating the woman about the head with his wings until she can't fight him off. Like, it's that type of thing. But this is romanticized. Because this is male gaze and toxic masculinity at that. This is Florenzel saying he's okay with humbling himself because it makes him like the gods. And the gods did it for beauty, but none of those girls were as beautiful as you are. These are stories written by men about male gods where the women don't have a choice here, and ultimately, most of the time, it's the women who get punished. These are queens who are locked away by their husbands or fathers because they've been told the kid will go on to kill them. One mother was locked in a coffin with hers and chucked off a cliff into the sea. These are women who are punished by the female gods then for having done this. Hera never goes after Zeus for the most part for his infidelities. She does go after the women. These are women who ask to see the gods' faces and then get burnt to a crisp because they've been tricked. That's how we got Dionysus. We have women who are then turned into animals. Poor Io didn't deserve that. So what happens to women in this story? We've already killed off at least one woman. Dropped another kid in the field. It's images like this that you have to be careful about. The flower language can be overwhelming and you might want to focus on that. Same with sexual innuendo. But you always have to take images of people comparing themselves to gods very carefully. And this particular comparison is questionable. Now, I'm assuming what Florenzo is trying to say is he doesn't care what his father thinks about this, but the message he's sending in the images he uses is that he doesn't necessarily care what the woman thinks, or Perdita thinks either. Which is not romantic. Ladies, if a guy says he wants to be like Zeus or Poseidon for you, maybe run. Well, that was a whole lot of double entendre and flowers and comparisons to rape. It's a comedy that was a tragedy and could still be. Next video we are going to finish this very long scene. We've still got a king in disguise, a prince in disguise, a princess who doesn't realize she's a princess, but her father and brother do. Yeah, we're gonna figure this all out shortly. So I'm gonna keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.